I'm Roberta Downey, a partner based in London, and I head the International Construction Disputes team. Frankly, I'm seeing the growth in technologies everywhere in the industry. The construction industry has always been at the forefront of innovation, and it's the same is true of its courts. In fact, it's interesting that in England, the specialist court is called the Technology and Construction Court. So the pairing has been recognised for a long time. But let me give you a couple of real examples. At the moment, we're in a time where you're seeing the convergence of two massive goals around the world that the construction industry is trying to feed. First, national and international targets for net zero. And in the construction industry, that's translating into bigger and further offshore in deeper water offshore wind farms, massive solar arrays, and a network of high voltage subsea cables to connect all these power sources together. The second goal is the digital economy's voracious appetite for power and how you feed that at a time when you're trying to go for net zero, because the digital economy requires 24/7 power, but renewables are intermittent by nature. And what runs through both of those two sectors is the transmission and connection to the grid. We have old transmission infrastructure radiating from ports which imported oil or gas and coal fields, but our resources are now, our renewable sources are now offshore or in far remote places, so it's having to be completely redrawn. Happily for construction lawyers, there are loads of friction points arising out of the use of technology, but I'll give you just three examples. First-of-a-kind technology. It's being rushed out into the market and then not performing in the field in the manner in which it was expected to during design. And when that happens, it takes much longer to fix it in the field. The construction site environment is much less sympathetic than trying to fix something in a factory or a laboratory. And it's inevitable that the first attempt at a fix is only the beginning. So it can take a long time to fix these problems, and that's very hard to forecast and provide for in a contract. Secondly is size. The upscaling of existing tested technology or the application of it in new environments has led to some surprising issues. There's been a very famous case, the MT Højgaard and E.ON case, where they took the existing technology for fixed offshore platforms and applied it to the more dynamic loads that are experienced in offshore wind farm foundations, and it had catastrophic results. Nearly 1,000 wind turbines were affected, and it took a long time and a huge amount of money to fix that problem. But we're seeing issues again now. Matters that were of secondary importance when things were smaller become of primary importance when it's upscaled. And you're seeing reports in the press now of blade failures on the next generation of offshore wind farms. Blades that used to be 30 meters are now 100 meters, and that brings different issues. And finally, my third example is connection to the grid. The offshore wind farms and solar arrays and data centers all require connections to the grid, and the queues are now up to 10 years in the waiting. So what people are doing is they're applying for connections before they really even know what they're going to develop. And what that leads to is what's called zombie projects, blocking up the system. Now, in the UK, they're trying to resolve that by saying you have to achieve certain milestones, otherwise you lose your connection to the grid. But that could have the inadvertent consequence of parties trying to rush to get their grid connection rather than de-risking the project with other testing or other elements of the project first. I think we'll continue to see the increasing application of AI in large-scale energy and infrastructure projects along the same trajectories as we're currently seeing. So wherever there's a repetitive procedure, or there's a large volume of evidence, or there's some standard form contracting or procedural hearings that can be dealt with remotely because they don't require the testing of factual and expert evidence. But beyond that, the very nature of large-scale energy and construction projects is such that it will constrain the use of AI. For example, the disputes are invariably resolved through arbitration or forms of ADR which are confidential, so there's less publicly available data for generative AI to draw from. And construction law itself is not self-contained. Different areas of the law can be relevant. We recently saw the surprising situation with the Supreme Court in England, in a tax case, decided the scope of a developer's right to vary under a standard form JCT contract in a construction project. That said, they say anything that's conceivable is possible. And some of the arbitral rules are now specifically saying that you must have a human arbitrator by specifying that it's a natural person or an individual. The very fact that they say that means they think it's conceivable that we will come a day when we'll not have a human arbitrator. Whether that happens in my lifetime remains to be seen.